Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here. Actually, it was nice that the last question that was asked, I would actually disagree there maybe with Viveka a bit, although I very much agree that it's very hard to combine them. I think there are some opportunities there, and we've seen this happen a bit in the Netherlands with all the hardships involved. We've also seen in Finland, but I'll get back to that later. What I'll do now is I'll discuss three things basically about the Netherlands, which are right there. So how does this debate arise? How do these municipalities come up with the idea of experimenting? How do these experiments relate to basic income? Because they're not full basic income trials, but what is their relation to the full basic income? And lastly, what their current status is. So I'll elaborate a bit on the paper, which already contains a lot of information about this. I won't go to everything there. You can find a lot of details there. I'll go a bit more into the last part as well, because in the past 3 weeks since I wrote the paper, we've already seen new developments, because things are developing rapidly. So I'll give you an update on that as well. And of course, I'll be happy to answer your questions afterwards, very much. So where do these experiments come from? They come from actually a variety of reasons, and that's what we've seen come back in this debate already. Malcolm Torrey already expressed there's so many reasons for which you could advocate the basic income, and some of these are kind of general, some of these depend on your political stance, and we've seen the same thing happening in the Netherlands, of course, with some things being stressed more or less. What we've seen is the basic income debate has been very strongly gaining momentum in the past 3 years, and this kind of started with an article published by a journalist who wrote about free money for everyone. Of course, this kind of set the tone, so because of this introduction of basic income in the Netherlands, we've seen a bit more interest on the kind of progressive side of the political spectrum, but not at all an isolated interest there. So we've seen it all across the political spectrum as well. But it started with this journalist and then a television program being made about this. It's called Rutger Bregman, you might know his name because he also wrote a book, which is now translated into many languages, Utopia for Realists. And it has been gaining ground since then. This debate about basic income in general came up, and at some point, this same television program made got in touch with an alderman in the Netherlands, in Groningen. I think he was the first alderman to say, hey, why don't we experiment with this on a municipal level? And then this discussion got going, and more municipalities started thinking, hey, but why can't we do that? Why can't we do that? Why can't we do that? This is also when I started to get into this debate, and there's basically been in about 50 municipalities across the Netherlands, we've had discussions, local discussions, people coming together, discussing, can't we do this here? And people have been involved from all kinds of backgrounds. Like I wrote here, local politicians from all parties across the political spectrum have taken initiative in these municipalities. So some municipalities were more of a progressive coalition, some more conservative or Christian Democrats, for example. But not only politicians, some of these initiatives came from kind of a citizens' initiative perspective, some of them came actually from researchers, some came from aldermen, some came from council members. So it was very interesting to see how all of this came around this theme, sometimes for very different reasons, and I would get questions like, basic income is about this, right? And then I would say, yeah, sure, it's about this, but it's also about all the other things people talk about. And it's been a major challenge to kind of keep this debate like this, which I very much agree with Viveka. It's hard to keep it on a general level, but there's also the danger of getting kind of having it polarized. So my role in all of this has been trying to bring in the nuance and try to not let it polarize and let all these kind of seeds flourish a bit. Okay, so we've seen also in the Netherlands many different reasons. So many of these have come by already. One major reason in the Netherlands, which might be emphasized, is also a very dissatisfaction with the current system. We've seen this come by a bit already, but our system has moved a bit towards more conditions in the past years, and especially municipalities themselves, who have gotten the responsibility for executing the most basic social security system. They are very unsatisfied with all the restrictions they have and the conditions they have to apply to the people that are in this system. So it's also from the kind of local perspective that they noticed, hey, what if we could have some bit more freedom? We want more freedom, but we have to do this from the national government, even though we are responsible for executing this system. That's one major reason, apart from all the other reasons we've already, work incentives, automation, future of work, everything has come by as well, health as well, obviously well-being. Then, how do these experiments relate to basic income? Because they are municipal experiments, and municipalities don't have, in Netherlands, don't have the authority to change the tax system, for example, which is one of the restrictions we also saw in Finland. However, like I said, they do have the responsibility to execute our most basic social assistance scheme. Within the law, within the national law, there's some room for experimenting. So they wanted to use this room, and therefore mainly for practical reasons, but also for others, which I'll come back to, they focus on tackling some of the differences between this system and the basic income. So here I've listed 4 reasons, the 4 main differences on a functional level between what we currently have in the Netherlands as a basic social security system, like the last resort social security system, and the basic income. And the first 2 are especially interesting because that's what the experiments focus on, but they're also, I think, some of the most debated parts of them, which are the conditions and the control in there. So I mean behavioral conditions in this case. I don't necessarily mean means testing, that's more in the second part. I mean behavioral conditions here, or conditions you have to, so you have to apply for a job, you have to participate in reintegration programs, you have to report what you're doing, you have to report your volunteer work, with how many people you're living, that kind of stuff. That's one part, so mostly the behavioral conditions. Secondly, the poverty traps, or the welfare traps in our current system. Which relate to this work disincentives idea that when people start working, they lose their benefits in proportion, which means that, and sometimes even because of all the complexity, they might even lose more benefits than they actually gain by starting paid labor. So that might mean that sometimes you are financially better off when you're not in a job than you are when you are in a job. So this is a second difference, obviously, with the basic income where you just start and then you build on top of that. The third and the fourth one are also, of course, big differences. So whether you look at the household level, individual level, our tax system in the Netherlands is mostly individual, but the social assistance scheme does look at your household. The fourth one is the difference between the negative income tax, which you're very hard to come by, and the basic income, which is whether you first give everyone a basic income and then, of course, collect taxes to pay for it, because at some point you have to pay for it, and there's this discounting, or whether you directly account for this, so via negative income tax, guarantee a certain level, and then have a kind of scheme that makes this work. But that's more of the way in which you execute the system, which has very important consequences, of course. Not to mention that it feels very different whether you pay everyone or at the same level, start in the same position, or actually account for things as in a negative income tax. But what's important here, what I want to note here, is that in the Netherlands, these municipalities, they could only focus on the first 2 because they don't have authority to go about the last 2, and they actually also needed to make use of a special room in the law to experiment within these first 2, and that's what most of the process has been about. I'll come back to that in a second. So what's important to say here as well is that this discussion, because these municipalities wanted to do something practical with this, and it was really kind of a bottom-up initiative from all these different local political parties across the spectrum. They wanted to experiment with this within the current welfare system, and national government wasn't really ready for this yet, in a sense. So they, especially the current, if there's any party that's really opposed to it, to the notion of a basic income in the Netherlands right now, is the one that's currently governing together with the Labour Party, which is more doubtful. So it's the Conservative Liberal Party, kind of. And they are kind of controlling the national government to a certain extent, and they wouldn't really be happy with the term basic income because of the way it was introduced in the Netherlands as free money for everyone, which kind of is not what they like to hear. So because of this framing, which is very different from the one in Finland, and that's very interesting because we're basically doing the same almost, but it's just a different name and it changes the whole political sphere. They had to kind of rebrand many of these experiments. They were presented as basic income experiments and inspired by these ideas and looking at the differences and what can we do in our municipality. But they have been rebranded sometimes to creative names like a trust experiment or a rule-free welfare, rule-less welfare, welfare with less rules. There's all kinds of names going around in the Netherlands to make sure that they could be presented in national government, distinct from the discussion on basic income, which is also going on very much within political parties, also on a national level, but it's still, in the Netherlands, this has gone really through the municipality, so there it's not very controversial anymore to talk about basic income at all, but on a national level, parties have been very kind of conservative and well, how do you say this, prudent in using this because they weren't sure what was happening, and we've seen this now, but I'll come back to that in the end when we talk about the political situation right now. So that's important to keep in mind. These experiments are still internationally known as basic income, related at least experiments. In the Netherlands, they are sometimes described like this, sometimes not, depending on who you ask. Okay, so what's going on now? This happened, like I said, in the last 3 years. The last 2 years, these experiments have arisen, mostly the last 1.5 years. In the end, 19 municipalities officially declared that they wanted to do this January to the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment. There has been this process going on with 4 of these municipalities. The 4 that were the first 4, which includes Utrecht, which has been most internationally known because of a coincidental article in The Independent, which is a nice story, but it's for another time. Then Groningen, Tilburg, and Wageningen. But those were the first to have their plans ready, but there's even 15 behind them that also wanted to do this. Like I said, there's been discussion in more municipalities, and right now it could be more. It could certainly be more than this, but it was in January. Then these 4 municipalities have been talking to the ministry, the ones I just mentioned, and they've been trying to get this legal framework out which would allow these experiments to start. But that was hard because of this political situation. So we've had to do a lot of, this is where my part of kind of lobbying has had to come in. We had to really find coordination between parties because Parliament wanted this. There was a majority in Parliament that wanted these experiments to start. However, because one of the parties in Parliament that does want this, namely the Labour Party, which is also in government, together with the Conservative Liberals, it was really hard to get it through because they had to kind of vote with the government or against it. So, and it wasn't, the State Secretary, which is actually of the Labour Party, who's on this, wasn't very enthusiastic about it personally, it seemed, at least. So there's been this very, tough political process going on. But in the end, finally, after a year of discussion, this document of 3 pages, which you can basically write in 2 days, came out. And there's many things to say about that. But they released this, unfortunately, very limited framework, because that's what you get with this political process, 2 months ago. And, this is a very limited framework. Many people are not happy about this. We actually, the researchers involved sent an open letter to the government stating, with this framework taken literally, we can't do good experiments. This is not scientifically valid, even though the government stresses that it should be scientifically valid. They kind of make this impossible by giving this very limited framework with all these extra conditions attached to the experiments. So, and we also wrote an open letter, or the municipalities wrote an open letter, saying we want something very different than the government now presents. Where does all this come from? However, this was a political compromise, and so this is as it stands. And municipalities will, however, be given as much space as possible within the framework. A recent motion in Parliament was adopted with this statement, and this basically means that you don't have to interpret this literally. What's in there? It's kind of a funny situation because the ministry says basically, this is the framework, and you can kind of, and then when you ask, but isn't this very limiting? Yeah, but you can kind of interpret it a bit differently, and then you can still get a lot of freedom as a municipality. So it's really, you see this practice and politics get very mingled, the political statements and what it will turn out in practice. But it is a limiting framework, and it is dangerous in a sense if you want to have a good experiment. These are risks. So we'll have elections next year, and if there's a new state secretary, he or she might look at this differently and might interpret it more literally, for example. So these things are risks. But yeah, there is a document now, and municipalities can experiment. I'm almost at the end. Because what is going on now? Well, because this framework is limiting and is also, from a national government perspective, really focusing, for example, on this employment incentives and getting people to work as soon as possible, even though municipalities in the Netherlands do want to measure broadly, want to look at health, well-being, social inclusion, all those kinds of broader effects which make this topic very interesting, I think. Because of that, and because of all the extra restrictions, such as that an extra group would have to be included, which would actually get more conditions, although you can then interpret this differently again as having more support, and that's all the things what it's about. Because of that, some municipalities who wanted to do this really from this bigger perspective, they said, no, this is not worth it. Others will be trying to really make the best out of it and see what's possible within this framework. So all the municipalities that have been involved so far will have to make this decision and are currently considering this. The experiments, it's very likely that they'll start, actually almost sure that they will start, because the legal document is now at the end of the line, the legal line almost. But it's not certain yet, very likely though. They'll probably start shortly before or after the summer of 2017 in the end. This also depends on how fast the municipalities can prepare the experiments, so it's done in also looking at that for the municipalities themselves. So there's discussions going on about this right now. And parallel to this, like I said, there has been some disconnect there, but parallel to this and in connection with this, there's the bigger discussion on basic income in the Netherlands going on and on basic income experiments. So we have parliamentary elections next March coming up, and some political parties have already written in their program about basic income and about supporting at least basic income experiments. So the idea and the hope is, I guess, that with these parliamentary elections, we'll get a new kind of surge of interest for more ambitious experiments, possibly, that will really be focusing on basic income on a national level as a policy, as a full policy. We've seen this discussion coming up, and there's a lot of potential for that. We'll have to see how that turns out. But for now, yeah, these two parallel things. We have these experiments that will probably start and will maybe teach us a bit, or at least provide a kind of a step on which other experiments could build and which discussion could proceed. And next to that, we have this lively discussion in the Netherlands going on about basic income for the future as a bigger policy idea, which might also light up in the coming elections. So things are, there's mixed news on the kind of the process of discussion in the Netherlands, but generally there's been this huge gain and momentum on this topic, and hopefully in the coming years this will continue so that we can really find out what we can do with basic income, both in the Netherlands and in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Sjir, and it's very reassuring to see that constructive ambiguity isn't confined to Irish politics. We've got that in the Netherlands too. Anybody for a quick question here? Yes, we've we got it. Yeah,
thank you. I feel I should say something because I'm from the political system. My name is Rose Conway-Walsh and I'm a Sinn Féin senator. I am surprised that there aren't other politicians here today. I am really enlightened about what you've been saying this morning, particularly coming out from under the umbrella of activation and how activation has been used to use and abuse people in this country, and particularly people with mental health or people who don't fit into the box that there's huge pressure to put them into there. So it really gives me courage, encourages me for the future, and particularly around the social multiplier effect. The experiments are really interesting. I would be a bit concerned around the limiting frameworks, and if that's going to, and I don't know if you can comment on that, if you feel that it may impose on the integrity of the models you're trying to put forward. But I would see this as very doable here. Absolutely doable. It just takes, an initiative. It just takes an initiative and a cooperation. And I certainly will be playing my part in it because I've worked in community development for years. I've seen how the whole community and voluntary sector has been destroyed in this country, and I have seen how people have been disempowered and how the whole political system is based on the disempowerment of people. I would say as well, I come from in terms of how this would be paid for, or how it might be paid for, how we might have a more equal distribution of wealth in our country, because we are a very wealthy nation, and it's no less in my own area that I come from. I live in the area of the Carb Gas project, and they are now having profits of 1.2 million a day, while we have huge unemployment and we don't even have basic infrastructure. So thank you.
Okay,
I know
just want to address it.
Yes, yes. That's actually a question I didn't address yet, and I can't answer with a kind of positive answer, which is that, like I said, there is a restrictive framework, but many of these municipalities are still really looking at this broadly themselves. So hopefully they'll be able to use this, and still they will, for example, be able to measure broadly. Even though the legal framework dictates it's mostly about unemployment, they will be allowed to measure more broadly, and the researchers involved, which are also coordinating they want to look at things more broadly. So the challenge then will be, of course, when this results are presented to also focus on this more broad perspective, because there will be measures of, for example, health, well-being, social inclusion, and the rest. So that's the positive side. The limiting framework is also really an experimental setup, so there's some details there, the limited time, the fact that municipalities will have to, like I said, add an extra group. They will have to, in some way, look at whether people are doing their best enough, but they can choose this way themselves. So there's these things, there's a lot of small risks in there, and together they add up to it becoming really hard. So this has also for myself been a reason to doubt whether I should still support these experiments in this line. But in the end, I've come back to, like I said, seeing them really as a kind of step, and also as a thing other countries can maybe, and from the whole process, learn from or adapt their plans from, just like the experiment in Finland. So I'm very happy to hear that there's enthusiasm from your side as well, and I hope, and I would very much encourage other countries like Ireland to draw from these lessons and hopefully come with even better experiments which will bring this discussion even further, and then we can all learn from each other.